For years, Life Below Zero has shown Sue Aikens battling blizzards, hunting in -60, and staring down predators. But there's one thing the cameras never showed us secret fans have wondered about for years. Today, Sue breaks her silence. And to understand it, we need to go back to when she and Glenn Villeneuve were the duo that defined the show. When you think of survival in Alaska, one name towers above the rest: Sue Aikens, the no-nonsense, fearless operator of Kavik River Camp. Sue has spent decades facing down some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Blizzards that can blind you in seconds, temperatures that can freeze exposed skin almost instantly, wolves and bears that stalk the edges of her camp. Out here, there's no backup, no safety net. You survive, or you don't. But in the early seasons of Life Below Zero, Sue wasn't the only one commanding attention. Enter Glenn Villeneuve, a man living alone in the Brooks Range, hundreds of miles from the nearest road or neighbor. Glenn's life was pure wilderness. No electricity, no running water. Every bite of food was earned by hunting, fishing, or trapping skills he had honed over years of living in near total isolation. At first glance, Sue and Glenn couldn't have been more different. Sue was the fiery personality, quick with a laugh, but even quicker to tell you exactly how it is. Glenn was the quiet thinker, methodical, deliberate, and almost zen-like in his approach to survival. And yet, this contrast is exactly what made their presence on the show so magnetic. Viewers were fascinated by how these two entirely different people could thrive in the same brutal environment, each using their own rules, their own rhythms, and their own philosophy about what it means to truly live off the land. For Sue, survival was about grit and adaptability. Just get it done, no matter what it takes. For Glenn, it was about patience, precision, and harmony with nature, never forcing a moment, always working with the environment instead of against it. On Life Below Zero, their worlds occasionally intersected, and when they did, it was a masterclass in survival from two completely different schools of thought. It was like watching fire and ice meet in the middle of the tundra, and for a time it worked beautifully until the cracks began to show. Before the cameras, before the fame, Sue Aikens was already a legend in her own right. Living alone at her remote outpost along the Kavik River, she had built a life in one of the harshest places on the planet, a place where even a minor mistake could mean death. Her days were a relentless cycle of hauling fuel, repairing equipment, hunting for food, and defending her camp from predators. It was a life she chose, and one she thrived in. Glenn Villeneuve's story unfolded hundreds of miles away, deep in the Brooks Range, a place so isolated it makes Kavik look like a bustling town. Glenn had left the modern world behind entirely, drawn to a raw, unfiltered connection with nature. Out there, survival wasn't just a skill, it was a constant state of being. Every meal was a victory. Every night of warmth was earned. And every step had to be calculated, because in the Arctic, there are no second chances. When Life Below Zero first brought their worlds to television in 2013, it wasn't scripted drama, it was a window into two radically different lives. Sue was bold, fast-talking, and unafraid to bend the rules if it meant staying alive. Glenn was patient, disciplined, and unshakable, letting the rhythm of the land dictate his moves. The show's early episodes captured something rare, a genuine authenticity that resonated with millions of viewers. People didn't just watch Sue and Glenn survive, they felt like they were surviving alongside them. Fans quickly became invested, not just in the breathtaking landscapes, but in the unspoken question: could these two very different approaches coexist in the same unforgiving world? For a while, the answer seemed to be yes, but Alaska has a way of testing everything and everyone. And soon, the real challenges began to surface. When Life Below Zero premiered in 2013, no one expected it to explode the way it did. What started as a raw, gritty documentary about life in the Arctic quickly became one of the most watched survival shows on television. Suddenly, Sue Aikens and Glenn Villeneuve weren't just living their remote lives. They were recognizable faces around the world. With that fame came change and pressure. The camera crews grew larger. The filming schedules became stricter, and there was a new, unspoken expectation every scene had to deliver. For Sue, the attention wasn't the problem. She had no trouble speaking her mind on camera or cracking a joke in the middle of a blizzard. But she knew the truth. Life in Alaska doesn't follow a production timeline. Out here, the weather decides everything. Glenn, on the other hand, had always approached survival like a slow, careful chess game. Every movement, Every decision had to be thought out. But television doesn't wait for patience, and neither do television deadlines. As the seasons rolled on, the raw, unpredictable lifestyle that drew them both to the show began to feel different. Scenes that once unfolded naturally were now squeezed into tight filming windows. Survival had always been hard enough now, it had to fit into a schedule. Sue later admitted, "The show had its expectations, but nature has its own. You can't tell a moose when to show up, and you can't order the sun to rise earlier because you need a good shot." For Glenn, that shift was even harder to accept. The more the show grew, the more it felt like it was pulling away from the pure, unscripted wilderness life he had signed up for. And slowly, the cracks began to form. At first, their differences were exactly what made Sue Aikens and Glenn Villeneuve so fascinating to watch. Sue thrived on adaptability, the kind of person who could patch up a snow machine with duct tape and get back to work before the wind picked up. Glenn, by contrast, believed in doing things the right way, even if it took longer. Perfectly set traps, meticulously planned hunts, carefully maintained gear. In the early seasons, those opposing approaches complemented each other. Sue's quick fixes and bold decisions could save the day in a pinch, while Glenn's careful planning ensured nothing was overlooked. Together, they balanced the scales. But as Life Below Zero grew, those differences started to feel less like balance and more like conflict. Sue understood the realities of television, the schedules, the need for action, the pressure to capture something worth airing. Sometimes, she admitted, you just have to make it happen, even if the conditions aren't perfect. For Glenn, that was where the problem began. He wasn't interested in making it happen for a camera. If the conditions weren't right, he'd wait. If a hunt took 3 days instead of 3 hours, so be it. The wilderness couldn't be rushed, and he wasn't about to change his pace for television. That difference in mindset slowly created a gap between them. What was once two unique survival philosophies working in harmony started to feel like two different worlds colliding. Sue was focused on meeting the demands of the show and surviving. Glenn was focused solely on living the way he believed was right, whether the cameras were rolling or not. It wasn't an explosive feud. There were no shouting matches or dramatic walkouts. Instead, it was a quiet drift, one decision at a time that would eventually lead Glenn away from the show completely. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single blow-up, no headline-worthy clash. Instead, Glenn Villeneuve's decision to leave Life Below Zero was the result of years of small, building frustrations, the kind that quietly wear a person down until the choice is no longer a choice at all. By 2019, the gap between Glenn's vision for his life and the reality of filming had become impossible to ignore. The long production schedules, the constant presence of cameras, and the push for moments that would keep audiences hooked. It was pulling him further away from the pure, self-reliant wilderness living that had defined his life. Sue Aikens remembers the moment she knew it was coming. Out here, you can see it in a person's eyes when they're ready to move on. Glenn's heart was in the wild, not in front of a lens, and I respected that. When the news broke that Glenn was leaving, fans were stunned. Social media buzzed with theories, money disputes, creative differences, even personal rifts. But Sue was quick to shut down the idea of bad blood. We didn't hate each other, we just had different paths. In the Arctic, you learn fast. You've got to walk the one that feels right under your feet. Glenn's departure left a noticeable void in the show. His calm, measured approach to survival was unlike anyone else's on Life Below Zero. And for many viewers, it was hard to imagine the series without the man who could quietly stalk a moose for miles or build a shelter from nothing but what the land offered. But for Glenn, leaving wasn't about the show losing something. It was about reclaiming something he felt he was losing, his way of life. Away from the cameras, he could live entirely on his terms again, with no one telling him when to hunt, when to move camp, or when to stop and talk to the audience. It was a bittersweet ending to one of the most intriguing partnerships the show had ever seen. And while Sue continued to hold down Kavik, Glenn faded from television screens, but not from the minds of the fans who had followed his every step. When the cameras stopped rolling for Glenn Villeneuve, his life didn't slow down, it just returned to the pace he had always preferred. No deadlines, no production calls, no scripted moments. Just him, the land, and the constant work of survival in the Brooks Range. Freed from the pressures of television, Glenn slipped back into a rhythm most people wouldn't survive a week in, tracking moose through endless snow, building shelters entirely by hand, stockpiling firewood not for a scene, but because a blizzard was on the horizon and the wind chill could drop to -60. Meanwhile, Sue Aikens stayed exactly where she'd been for decades at her beloved Kavik River Camp, holding her ground against the brutal Arctic. But life for Sue was different now. She was still a central figure on Life Below Zero, still sharing her unfiltered wisdom and grit with millions of viewers. And while she faced the same dangers as always, from hungry predators to sudden storms, she also carried the weight of representing a lifestyle fewer and fewer people dared to live. Sue thrived under the spotlight, balancing the reality of survival with the demands of production. Glenn thrived in solitude, answering only to the land and his own instincts. Two very different choices, but both staying true to themselves. In their own ways, they had each found what they were looking for. Sue had a platform to show the world the beauty and danger of Alaska. Glenn had his privacy, his peace, and the unbroken silence of the wilderness. And yet, for the fans who had watched them from the start, one question still lingered. After everything they'd shared on Life Below Zero, could their paths ever cross again? No matter how different their paths became, there's no denying the mark Sue Aikens and Glenn Villeneuve left on Life Below Zero and on the survival genre as a whole. Together, they showed the world that life in the Arctic isn't just about enduring the cold. It's about resilience, resourcefulness, and the constant push to adapt when nature throws its worst at you. They gave viewers a rare window into two completely different survival philosophies: Sue's fierce, adaptable, get-it-done approach, and Glenn's patient, methodical, let-the-land-decide mindset. That contrast didn't just make for good television. It inspired a new wave of people to think about self-reliance, wilderness skills, and what it really means to live without a safety net. Even now, long after Glenn's departure, fans still talk about the Sue and Glenn years as a golden era for the show. They weren't just two people surviving on camera, they were living examples of how determination, skill, and a refusal to quit can make the impossible possible. Their time together proved one thing above all: in the Arctic, there's no single right way to survive, but you do have to find the way that's right for you. And in doing so, both Sue and Glenn carved out legacies that will outlast any television season. So, will Sue Aikens and Glenn Villeneuve ever share the screen again? Sue just smiles when asked and says, "Never say never." In the Arctic, the unexpected is part of the job, and if there's one thing these two have taught us, it's that anything can happen when survival is on the line. For now, Sue continues to hold down Kavik, her laughter and grit echoing across the tundra, while Glenn moves silently through the Brooks Range, leaving only footprints in the snow. Two lives, two paths, one unforgettable chapter in Life Below Zero history, and if those paths ever cross again, it won't just be survival, it'll be television history in the making.